In the fall of 2017, I rented a small cabin in northern Minnesota, a few miles outside a town called Carlton. I was 39 at the time, living in Minneapolis, and after a long year of dealing with people, clients, coworkers, neighbors, I needed quiet. My job at a logistics company had worn me down. I'd saved up enough vacation days for a solid 2-week break and decided to get as far from the city as I could without crossing state lines. I didn't want beaches or resorts or anything fancy. I just wanted a place where I could sit with my thoughts, go hiking, cook some simple food, and sleep without car horns or sirens outside my window. The cabin I found online looked perfect. It sat on the edge of a thick patch of forest near the southern tip of Black Lake. The pictures showed an old structure made of weathered cedar with a stone chimney and a narrow dock stretching out into the water. The listing described it as a rustic one-bedroom with a kitchen, a small living room, a screened porch, and a wood-burning stove. No TV, no Wi-Fi. The owner, an older guy named Dale who lived in town, left the keys in a lockbox on the back door. I arrived in early October. The air smelled like damp pine needles, and the trees were in that in-between stage, half green, half gold. The gravel road leading to the property was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for one car. The last stretch was rough, and I had to slow down to avoid scraping the underside of my Honda. When I pulled up, the place looked even more remote than I expected. The nearest cabin was at least a quarter-mile away, maybe more, and there wasn't a single sound around me except the faint rustle of trees. Inside, it was simple but clean. One bedroom with a double bed and a metal frame window looking out at the trees. A small kitchen with an old gas stove and a fridge that buzzed quietly. The bathroom was surprisingly modern with decent plumbing. The living room had a sagging brown couch, a faded rug, and a couple of wooden chairs near the stove. There was a shelf with a few paperbacks, mostly thrillers and some beat-up old guidebooks. Everything smelled like cedar and dust. The first 3 days were great. I went for long hikes in the woods, usually following an overgrown path behind the cabin that curved toward the lake and then looped back through a patch of dense pine. I cooked simple meals, eggs in the morning, canned soup or sandwiches for lunch, pasta or fish for dinner. I'd sit on the dock in the evenings, listening to the loons on the lake and watching the sky darken. The nights were cold, but the stove worked well. I chopped some wood using the old hatchet I found by the shed and kept a small fire going most nights. I didn't bring much, just a couple of bags, a flashlight, a book, and a notebook. I didn't even bother with my phone most days. It was on the 4th night that things started feeling strange. I'd gone to bed early, around 9:30. I remember waking up suddenly sometime after midnight. I wasn't sure why, but something had pulled me out of sleep. The room was dark except for a bit of moonlight coming through the window. I lay there, eyes open, trying to listen. There wasn't much, just the creaking of the cabin, maybe a breeze outside. I turned over and tried to fall back asleep. Took longer than usual. The next morning, I went out to the shed to grab more firewood. As I stepped around the side of the cabin, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, boots. They were faint but definitely human. At first, I told myself they must have been mine from earlier in the week, maybe when I checked around the property. But I walked those steps in my head and realized I hadn't gone near that side. Not since the day I arrived. The prints went from the edge of the woods toward the back porch, then doubled back. They looked recent. The ground was soft from rain 2 nights ago, and these hadn't washed away. I checked the lockbox, still closed, back door still locked. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone had wandered too close. A hunter, maybe. Still, I walked the perimeter of the cabin just to be sure. Nothing else seemed off. That night, I slept lightly. Every little sound snapped me awake. The wind brushing tree branches, the creak of the porch, even the shift of the cooling stove. Around 2 a.m., I heard a definite sound. A short, dry crunch outside, like someone stepping on dead leaves. I sat up slowly, heart beating hard. I stayed completely still for a minute, listening. Another soft crunch, then nothing. I got up and moved to the window. I couldn't see much, just black trees and a bit of moonlight over the lake. I didn't see anyone. The next day, I found more tracks. These ones came from the opposite direction, from the far side of the trees behind the shed. They stopped about 10 feet from the cabin. I felt something shift in me then, a subtle fear, like the edge of something I didn't want to see. I didn't have binoculars, but I used my phone's camera zoom to scan the woods from the back porch. Nothing moved. I didn't see tents, smoke, or flashlights. I told myself maybe it was just some local, curious, maybe a little nosy. But that didn't explain why they came at night or why they didn't knock or call out. I didn't sleep much that night either. I kept a hatchet by the bed. The stove burned low. Around 3 a.m., I heard a knock. One knock, sharp and deliberate, on the side of the cabin near the living room. I sat up in the dark, frozen. I didn't move for at least 5 minutes. No footsteps, no other sounds, just that one deliberate knock. I didn't look out the window this time. I waited until the sky began to lighten before I got up. I spent the whole next day on edge. Every sound made me flinch. I debated packing up and leaving, but something about that felt like giving in. I wasn't hurt. The place hadn't been broken into. I didn't want to run from shadows. Still, I kept the fire going during the day, more to feel less alone than for warmth. On the 7th day, I woke up to find something nailed to a tree about 20 feet from the cabin. It was a piece of cardboard. At first, I thought it was trash, but it was pinned up with a rusted nail. I got closer and saw a jagged hole in the middle, like it had been torn or stabbed through. No writing, no marks, just a ripped piece of cardboard nailed to a tree, facing the cabin. It was so specific and weird I didn't know how to react. It didn't feel random, felt like a message. I yanked it down and tossed it into the fire. I made the decision then to leave early. I packed up that afternoon, locked everything, and started driving out. About halfway down the gravel road, I stopped the car and stepped out. I stood still for a minute and listened. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching. Not just visiting the cabin, but watching from the woods. Following, maybe, waiting. It wasn't paranoia. It was something in my gut that kept tightening each day I stayed. Back in Minneapolis, I didn't tell anyone much about it. A few coworkers asked how the cabin was, and I just said it was quiet. I didn't go into detail. What could I say? That someone knocked on my wall at 3 in the morning and left weird cardboard signs in the woods? That I found boot prints around the place without any explanation? I didn't have photos or proof, just memories and a knot in my stomach that didn't ease up for weeks. About a month later, I got a call from a private number. I didn't answer it. No message was left. Then it happened again a few days later. I finally picked up the 3rd time, but there was nothing, just silence and a faint clicking sound, like wind on a microphone. I hung up. It never happened again. I didn't go back to any cabin for the next few years. I stuck to hotels. I told myself maybe it had been some local messing around, maybe even some kid. But deep down, I don't think that's it. Whoever it was didn't want to scare me off right away. They wanted to watch me, to get close. It wasn't about stealing anything or hurting me, at least not at first. It felt like a slow game, the kind where you don't even realize you're part of it until you're too far in. Looking back, I think leaving early was the right call. If I'd stayed longer, maybe they would have tried to come inside. Maybe they were just waiting for me to let my guard down. Maybe they would have knocked again, only harder. Or maybe they'd stop knocking entirely. Just walk in. I still think about that place sometimes. I even looked up the cabin listing again the next year. It was gone, taken off the rental site. No forwarding link, nothing. I searched the address, but all I found was a plot of land listed as vacant. No mention of the cabin. It's like it never existed, but I know it did. I still dream about it sometimes. The quiet lake, the crunch of leaves, and that single knock in the night that broke everything. It was the fall of 2017, and I was 31 years old. My name's Kevin Dobson, and back then, I worked as a freelance industrial designer based out of Columbus, Ohio. Work had been steady for most of the year, and I'd saved up enough to take a couple weeks off before winter really set in. I didn't want anything fancy, no cities, no long flights, Just some quiet place where I could get away from people, clear my head, and maybe even sketch a little if I felt like it. I found this old cabin listed on a rental site tucked away deep in the Allegheny National Forest, Pennsylvania. The listing was bare bones, just a few photos, no reviews, but it showed a small, single-room wooden cabin beside a narrow stream. The trees were already golden and orange in the photos. It looked perfect. The guy who posted it left a short note about it being rustic, off-grid, and better suited for those wanting full solitude. I booked it for 9 days straight. I packed light, mostly warm clothes, my thick boots, a portable camping stove, a cooler with enough dry food and perishables, a large flashlight, some basic tools, my sketch pad, and a couple spare battery packs for my phone. There was no service out there, which I expected. That was fine. I brought a topographic map printed from Google Earth and a compass just in case. The drive from Columbus took just under 6 hours. Once I passed Warren, the roads thinned out, and signs became few and far between. After about 20 minutes on a gravel logging road, I reached the end of a narrow trail. There was a rusty chain across it and a small wooden sign nailed to a tree, "Cabin Trail Private." That was it. I parked my car just off the shoulder, pulled on my pack, and followed the trail by foot. Took about 45 minutes to hike in. The trail was uneven and mostly covered in dead leaves. I didn't see anyone, not even a squirrel. Eventually, the trees opened a bit and I spotted the roof of the cabin peeking over some brush. It sat on a slight incline next to a stream, just like in the photos. The place looked weathered but solid: log walls, a metal roof, and one small chimney. There was no sign of recent activity. A narrow wooden porch ran across the front with a single rocking chair and a dry stack of firewood leaning against the side. The door wasn't locked. Inside, it was one room. A cot, a wood stove, a tiny table with 2 mismatched chairs, and some cabinets against the far wall. There was a rusty pump sink next to a sealed-off pipe. Must have been for collecting rainwater or gray water, but it didn't work. No fridge, no bathroom, just a chemical toilet in a shed about 30 feet behind the cabin. The silence was deep. I could hear the stream, some birds in the trees, and the occasional rustle from falling leaves. No engines, no people. I loved it. I settled in quick. That first day I unpacked, swept out the dust, and chopped a few logs just for the rhythm of it. I made a simple dinner, read for a bit, and went to bed early. That night I slept like a stone, the wood stove keeping the place warm. The first few days were peaceful. I hiked in the mornings and spent the afternoons sketching the trees, the shape of the hills, the way the light filtered through the canopy. On the third day, it rained steadily, so I stayed inside and worked on designs for a chair I had in mind. Nothing unusual happened. The only odd thing I noticed was a faint, rotting smell near the back of the cabin. I figured it was some small animal that died under the floor or in the shed. I didn't investigate. By day 5, I noticed something strange. That morning, I found a boot print in the mud near the stream. It wasn't mine. It was broader, maybe a size 12, and the tread was different, looked like heavy-duty hiking boots. I thought maybe someone had passed through while I was asleep. Not unheard of, even way out here. Still, I kept my pocket knife in my jacket the rest of the day, just in case. The next night, I was up late reading by the light of my lantern when I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. 2 quick thuds on the porch boards. I froze. I turned the light off and sat still, my ears straining. The cabin was dark except for a faint glow from the embers in the stove. The sound didn't repeat. I stayed sitting for what felt like an hour, heart beating in my ears. Nothing. The next morning I checked the porch. No prints, no scuff marks, just leaves and dust. I convinced myself it had been a branch falling or an animal, maybe a raccoon. That afternoon, I hiked out half a mile to where the stream widened a little, trying to clear my head. I followed the edge of the water, hoping to spot wildlife or interesting rocks. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. On a flat stone near the water was a small pile of stacked twigs, arranged neatly, like a tiny teepee. Around it were 3 ringed stones, almost like a miniature campfire. It was too clean to be natural. It looked deliberate, like someone made it recently. I didn't touch it, I backed away and went straight back to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep much. On the 7th day, it got worse. That morning, I woke up to find the cabin's door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. There was an old sliding bolt I used each night, and I remembered clearly sliding it before bed. But now it was off the latch. Nothing inside was taken or moved. At least nothing obvious. The cooler was still closed. My tools were where I left them. Still, it rattled me. I checked my pack, my phone, everything. All still there. I was fully alone, but I didn't feel alone anymore. That afternoon, I searched the area thoroughly. I walked circles around the cabin, checked the trail, the woods behind the shed, even climbed a tree to get a better view. Nothing, just trees and silence. That night, I stayed awake in the rocking chair with my flashlight in hand and my pocket knife within reach. At one point, around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the faint sound of something being dragged, slow, crunching movement through leaves, coming from uphill behind the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't shine the light. I just waited. It stopped after a few minutes. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found something on the porch. It was a dead bird, some kind of thrush or finch. Its neck was twisted, wings spread out unnaturally. It had been placed carefully, centered right in front of the door. That was it for me. I packed everything I could into my backpack, slammed the bolt shut behind me, and started the hike back to the car. I didn't care that I had 2 days left. I needed to get out. When I reached the spot where the trail met the logging road, I stopped cold again. My car was still there, but the rear window had been smashed in. Not shattered, smashed. Glass all over the seat. Someone had used something heavy. A rock or pipe, maybe. Nothing was stolen that I could tell. My glove box had been opened, the papers scattered, but nothing else taken. I cleaned out the glass as best I could and drove back to Warren with the cold air whipping through the broken window. I told the rental site the cabin was unsafe and left a detailed report. I didn't hear back. They removed the listing 2 weeks later. Back in Columbus, I had trouble sleeping for a long time. I kept thinking about that sound in the night, the tiny twig structure by the stream, the boot print, the dead bird. It wasn't one thing that scared me, it was the buildup. The signs that someone had been watching me, not rushing in or doing anything dramatic, just watching, getting closer each day. I never saw a face. I never heard a voice, but someone was out there, and they wanted me to know it. I still go camping now, but only with friends, never alone, and never anywhere that quiet again. I was 34 the summer I decided to take a break from everything. My name's Travis, and back then I was working in a metal fabrication plant in Omaha, Nebraska. I'd been at it for 11 years. Long shifts, rotating weekends, no room to breathe. One afternoon in June 2023, something in me snapped. I drove home from work soaked in sweat, took one look at myself in the mirror, and decided I needed to disappear for a bit. Not forever, just long enough to clear my head. I didn't want to fly, and I didn't want to be near people. So I went online and searched for remote cabins for rent within driving distance. I ended up booking a small off-grid place in the western part of Montana, somewhere near Libby. The listing was buried deep on a forum, not a big site. No reviews, but it looked clean. Said it was built in the early 90s, had a wood stove, running water from a gravity-fed tank, a generator for a couple of lights, and no cell signal for miles. That was perfect. I packed my truck with everything I thought I'd need. Non-perishables, a cooler with ice, a sleeping bag, basic tools, fishing gear, a shotgun I never really used, just in case. Took me 2 days to drive up. I stopped in Missoula for supplies, then another 3 hours north. The road started thinning out, gas stations got further apart, and by the time I hit Libby, I already felt the weight coming off my shoulders. To get to the cabin, I had to drive another 20 miles on dirt roads that twisted up into the mountains. It was evening when I finally found the place. The cabin was tucked in a clearing surrounded by dense pine trees, with a tiny creek flowing about 30 feet behind it. No neighbors, no cars, no signs of life, just a small shed, a propane tank, and a hand-painted sign nailed to the porch that said, Spruce Hollow. Inside, the place was simple: wood walls, a cot with a thin mattress, a counter with a camp stove, some open shelves with cookware, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. There was a desk by the window with an old oil lamp and a folding chair. A door in the back led to a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet and a bucket shower setup. Nothing fancy, but it was clean. I unpacked, lit a lantern, and heated up some canned chili. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I had to do anything or answer to anyone. The first couple of days were exactly what I needed. I read a little, hiked around the property, fished in the creek, caught a few small ones. I kept a little journal, mostly to remind myself why I came out here. Each morning, I chopped wood for the stove, boiled water for coffee, and sat on the porch for hours. The air was clean, and the only sound was the wind in the trees and the water in the creek. It was around the fourth day when things started to feel off. I woke up one morning to find the front door cracked open. I was sure I'd latched it the night before. There was no wind, and the cabin didn't have a warped frame or anything like that. I looked around, checked the windows. Everything was shut. Nothing was missing. I told myself I'd probably just been tired and forgot to secure the door. That afternoon, I hiked up the ridge behind the cabin, hoping to get a better view of the area. It was steep and thick with undergrowth, but I made it to a small clearing. From there, I could see the cabin below through the trees. I sat for a while, drank some water, and was just about to head back when I noticed something strange in the dirt near where I'd set my pack. A footprint. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, pressed into a patch of soft soil. Bigger than mine, maybe a size 13 boot, and deeper, like the person had some weight on them. I looked around, but I didn't hear anything. Still, I felt watched. I didn't run, but I packed up quick and made my way back down. When I got back to the cabin, I checked everything again. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I put a chair under the doorknob and set a small cooking pot on top so I'd hear if someone tried to come in. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sharp clang. The pot had fallen. My heart slammed against my chest. I sat up, grabbed the flashlight and my shotgun, and listened. Nothing. I checked the door. It was still closed, but the chair had moved a little. Not a lot, but enough to notice. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up with the light on, the shotgun across my lap. When the sun came up, I stepped outside, scanned the clearing, and walked the perimeter. I found more footprints, this time behind the cabin near the creek. Same size, same direction, like someone had circled around. I followed them for a while, but lost them where the pine needles got thick. I didn't leave right away. I should have, but I didn't. Part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. Another part told me maybe it was just a hunter passing through. But by the next night, I couldn't ignore it. I'd just gotten into bed when I heard it. Movement outside. Not an animal. Slow, deliberate steps on the gravel path that led from the shed to the porch. I turned off the lantern, crept to the window, and waited. Took a full minute, but then I saw him. A man standing just beyond the edge of the porch light, barely visible. He wasn't wearing a backpack or carrying anything obvious, just dark clothes and heavy boots. He stood there, perfectly still, like he was listening. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After maybe 2 minutes, he turned and walked away. Slow and quiet, like he knew I was watching but didn't care. That was it. The next morning, I packed up everything I could fit into the truck. I left some gear behind, my folding chair, a few cooking things, even some food. I didn't want to be out there any longer than I had to. When I got to town, I found the closest ranger station and told them what happened. They sent a guy up to check it out, but they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no damage, nothing. Just footprints, which they said could have been mine. I knew better. I didn't go back for the rest of my gear. I didn't care. When I got home, I changed all my locks, bought motion lights, and started sleeping with a baseball bat next to the bed. I didn't tell many people what happened. Most wouldn't get it. They'd say I imagined it or I overreacted. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there. And the worst part is not knowing why. He didn't try to rob me. He didn't break anything. He just watched. Came close enough to open a door, knock a pan down, stand where I could almost see him. That kind of quiet, patient behavior, it's not normal. It's not something you forget. I still love the idea of being out in the woods, but I'll never go alone again. Not like that. Not without a second vehicle, a radio, or at least someone who'd notice if I didn't come back. Some people think danger always comes loud, with shouting, gunshots, or chaos. But sometimes danger comes quiet, with slow steps in the dark, and someone standing just out of reach, just waiting. And that's what stays with you the longest. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend some time alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 27 years old then, working as a junior editor in a publishing house, the kind of job where days blended into each other without much change. The idea of a quiet week away from the noise, people, and constant stress seemed like a perfect way to clear my head. I found the cabin through a small ad in a local magazine. An old man named Henry rented it out during the off-season, promising solitude and peace. I wanted just that, peace. The cabin was about 30 miles from the nearest town, tucked far back on a narrow dirt road that wound its way through thick pine forests and rocky hills. The trees were already changing colors, their leaves burnt orange, yellow, and red, falling softly in the cool breeze. When I arrived, the sun was just dipping low behind the hills, casting long shadows that made the woods look darker than they should have been for that hour. The air smelled clean, with a faint hint of damp earth and pine sap. The cabin itself was small, maybe 600 square feet, with a single room that had a stone fireplace, a little kitchen corner, and a narrow loft for sleeping. The wood smelled old but not rotten, and the windows were dusty but clear enough to see outside. It had the kind of worn charm that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. There was no electricity, no phone line, and certainly no internet. It was all part of the appeal, an escape from everything. That first night, after setting down my bags and lighting a fire, I sat quietly, listening to the crackling logs and the strange, distant sounds of the forest. Somewhere, a bird called out, maybe a barred owl, and the wind whispered through the trees. The cabin felt safe, but also isolated in a way I hadn't expected. I slept well, waking only once to the cold air sneaking in through a gap in the window frame. The next morning, I explored the small area around the cabin. There was a narrow path leading downhill toward a river I had heard about from Henry when I met him briefly to get the keys. The forest was thick but walkable, with moss-covered rocks and fallen logs. The sound of rushing water grew louder as I got closer, and I found the river cutting through the woods, clear and cold, moving fast over smooth stones. I sat on a flat rock for a while, watching the water swirl, feeling calm in the quiet that stretched around me. Days passed quietly. I read, walked, cooked simple meals over the fire, and kept a journal by candlelight. The woods were alive with subtle sounds, the tapping of woodpeckers, the rustle of squirrels gathering nuts, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The sky changed from clear blue to overcast gray, and the first frost arrived in the early mornings, painting the grass white and stiff. On the fourth night, the weather shifted. The wind picked up in strength, rattling the cabin's shutters and making the trees groan. It started to rain, first lightly, then harder. I sat close to the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket, feeling the cabin shake a little with the wind. Outside, the storm made the forest sound like a living thing, wild and angry. That was when I noticed something unusual. Around midnight, as I stared into the flames, I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks, but the sound was too distinct. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching leaves on the ground, moving in a circle around the cabin. I froze, every muscle tense. The flashlight by the door was within reach, but I didn't want to open the door and expose myself. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a long moment, there was silence except for the rain hitting the roof. Then, a faint tapping, like someone lightly knocking on the cabin wall. I didn't respond, didn't move. After a few minutes, the noises stopped. I waited, listening until the forest fell quiet again. Sleep came hard, and when it did, it was filled with restless dreams. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of who or what might have been outside. I found footprints in the muddy earth, big, heavy prints that didn't match any animal I knew. They were too large for a deer, and the pattern was wrong for a bear or a coyote. They seemed human. Whoever had made them was careful, sticking close to the trees, as if avoiding being seen. The thought unsettled me. I was alone in a remote place, and someone had come close enough to the cabin in the middle of the night. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, but the cabin was old and didn't have much in the way of security. I debated what to do. The nearest town was far, and I didn't have a working phone. Calling Henry wasn't an option. I decided to stay but be more cautious. That day, I noticed other strange things. Small signs of someone's presence. A broken branch near the path, fresh but snapped off with force. Tiny piles of disturbed leaves that looked like someone had been sitting or crouching nearby. Sometimes, from the cabin windows, I caught glimpses of movement in the forest, shadows shifting just beyond the trees. I kept the fire going constantly, hoping the light and smoke would keep whoever was out there at bay. I didn't venture far from the cabin after dark. The fifth night was worse. The wind had died down, but the forest felt thicker, heavier. Around 11 p.m., the footsteps returned, this time accompanied by faint whispers carried by the breeze. The voice wasn't clear, but it wasn't the wind. I stayed inside, heart pounding, trying to make myself small and invisible. Then the tapping came again, louder, more urgent on the front door. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I had and edged toward the door. The knocking stopped abruptly. I waited, listening, but the only sounds were my ragged breathing and the rain against the windows. Morning light felt like a relief I had never appreciated before. I checked the area again, and this time I found more footprints, clearer and fresher than before. It was no longer just one set. There were two, maybe three. They had been walking in circles, moving around the cabin carefully but without fear. The realization hit me hard. I was not just being watched. Someone had been camping nearby, hidden, possibly tracking me. The forest that had seemed so peaceful before was now a trap. I spent the next day planning. I gathered as many dry sticks as I could find and made a large fire pit out front, a smoke signal if needed. I kept my knife close and started making a list of what I would do if anyone tried to come inside. I also decided to check my supplies and pack a bag in case I had to leave quickly. The dirt road back to the main highway was a few miles away, and I remembered the directions Henry gave me. I could make it if I started early enough. That night, I slept with the door unlocked but barricaded with a chair and a heavy box. I had the knife on the bed beside me. Still, I was exhausted, worn down by the tension. Around 2 a.m., the tapping returned, but this time it wasn't light or hesitant. It was hard, deliberate, almost like pounding. The door shook as if someone was trying to force it open. I held my breath and gripped the knife tightly. The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by the scuffling of feet running away into the woods. I didn't move until dawn. When the first light came, I saw footprints leading away from the cabin into the deeper forest, hurried and confused. I packed quickly, heart racing, adrenaline fueling my hands. I didn't want to stay another minute. The hike back along the dirt road was tense. Every noise in the woods made me jump. I kept looking back, expecting someone to appear out of the trees. But I made it, finally, to the highway and flagged down a passing car. They took me to the nearest town, where I called Henry. When I told him what happened, he listened quietly. Then he admitted something I had suspected but didn't want to hear. This part of the woods was known for people who lived off the grid, some dangerous, some desperate. Henry said the cabin was usually safe, but sometimes people from the nearby towns or drifters looking for shelter would come close or even try to break in. I never went back to that cabin. The weeks after, I felt jumpy, always checking behind me, never feeling fully safe. But I learned a lot that week about fear, isolation, and how people sometimes live on the edge of society in places most of us don't see. What started as a peaceful retreat turned into a stark reminder. Nature can be beautiful and quiet, but it can also hide dangers much closer than you think. And sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real PE. It was the summer of 1998 when I first decided to get away from everything. I was 27, tired of the noise and rush of city life in Portland, Oregon. The air felt thick with stress and too many faces. I craved silence, space, and a place where I could think without interruptions. So, I rented a small cabin deep in the Cascade Mountains, about 2 hours northeast of the city, near a little town called Sisters. The cabin was simple, no electricity, no internet, just wood walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a gas stove, and a single bedroom. I found it through a local rental agency that specialized in remote places for people who wanted to escape. The owner, an old man named Harold, assured me it was peaceful and safe. The cabin sat on the edge of a thick forest, right next to a narrow dirt road that led back to civilization, but it felt miles away from anything. I arrived in the late afternoon on a Friday, carrying only a backpack with essentials: some canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, matches, a first aid kit, and a small axe Harold suggested I bring. The sun was already dipping low, casting long orange shadows through the pine trees as I pulled up to the cabin. It looked exactly like the pictures, worn but sturdy, with a small porch and a woodpile stacked neatly by the side. The air smelled like pine and earth, fresh and cool. I opened the door and the cabin smelled like old wood and faint smoke from the last fire. Inside, the floor creaked slightly under my boots. I set my bag down and walked around, inspecting everything. The fireplace looked ready for a fire, and the small kitchen had a rusty but working sink and the gas stove I'd seen in the pictures. There was a small table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner covered with a rough wool blanket. I lit a fire quickly, the flames crackling and warming the cabin instantly. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but inside I felt safe and warm. I ate a quick dinner of beans and bread, then settled in to read a book I'd brought. The silence was complete except for the occasional crackle from the fire and the soft sounds of the forest outside. That first night, I slept well, wrapped up warm against the cold that seeped in through the walls. When I woke the next morning, the cabin was filled with golden sunlight, and birds chirped in the trees. I stepped outside and breathed deeply. The forest was alive and peaceful. I decided to explore the nearby woods, so I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, my knife, and my flashlight just in case. The woods stretched thick and green in every direction, full of tall pines, firs, and underbrush. The air smelled sharp and sweet. I followed a narrow deer trail deeper into the forest, the ground soft underfoot with moss and fallen leaves. It felt good to walk, to be surrounded by nothing but nature. I walked for hours, sometimes climbing small hills, sometimes stopping to look at the sun filtering through the trees. At one point, I found a small creek trickling over smooth rocks, its water cold and clear. I knelt down and drank some, feeling refreshed. The forest was peaceful but vast, and I made sure to keep track of where I was going, marking trees with small scratches on the bark so I could find my way back. By late afternoon, I headed back toward the cabin, the sun starting to lower behind the mountains. When I reached the dirt road near the cabin, I saw tire tracks and footprints, probably from hunters or hikers. I didn't think much of it and went inside to make dinner. After another fire, I sat by the window and watched the trees sway in the dusk. The next day was similar. I explored more trails, collected some dry wood for the fire, and enjoyed the quiet. The nights were dark without streetlights or moonlight sometimes, but the stars made the sky a brilliant tapestry. I felt almost like I belonged there. Then, on the third day, things started to feel off. It began with a sound. I was chopping wood outside when I heard something rustling in the bushes a little way off. I stopped and looked but saw nothing. Maybe a deer or a rabbit. But the noise came again. Soft snapping twigs, light rustling. I scanned the trees but couldn't spot anything moving. I shrugged it off and went back to chopping. Still, my skin felt prickly. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. The wind was low, so I was sure it wasn't just the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam across the dark clearing. No one there. The forest was still. The next day, I noticed more signs. Near the edge of the woods, where I'd been collecting firewood, I found strange markings carved into a tree trunk, deep scratches that didn't look natural. They were jagged and uneven. I hadn't seen anything like them before. I tried to think of an explanation. Maybe some local kids messing around? Or hunters marking territory. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. But inside, I felt a growing unease. That afternoon, I decided to take a longer hike to clear my head. I went further than before, crossing a small ridge and looking out over a valley filled with forest and a distant river glinting in the sun. The beauty was overwhelming, but as I turned to head back, I realized I didn't recognize the trees or landmarks. I'd lost the trail. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest all looked the same. Tall trunks, green needles, undergrowth thick and tangled. I pulled out my compass and map from the pack. The map was basic, showing only the main dirt roads and the cabin location. I tried to orient myself, but the sun was moving fast, and the shadows made it harder to tell direction. I started walking, hoping to find the dirt road again, but every path seemed to lead me deeper into the woods. The sky was growing darker. My heart pounded as I realized I might be stuck. The forest felt colder now, the wind picking up, rattling branches. I wanted to scream, but the silence swallowed any sound. I kept walking, calling out, but only my own voice answered back, echoing between the trees. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted a faint path. I followed it, my legs tired and my mind foggy. Just as the last light disappeared, I reached a clearing and saw the cabin's roof peeking above the trees. Relief flooded me. I ran the last few steps and pushed open the door. Inside, I lit the fire again and sat down, my body shaking. The cabin felt like a sanctuary. I told myself I'd be more careful and not wander so far again. But that night, the sounds returned, louder and closer. Branches snapped, footsteps circled the cabin, and something dragged along the dirt outside. I stayed awake, clutching the axe, staring at the door and windows. At one point, I heard a low, guttural noise, like a growl. My breath caught, and I tried to tell myself it was a wild animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But the sounds didn't match anything I knew. I stayed alert until dawn, and when the sun finally rose, the noises stopped. The next morning, I found large paw prints pressed deep into the soft earth around the cabin, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. I didn't know what to make of it. The prints didn't match any animal I could identify. I checked my supplies and realized I only had a day's worth of food left. The nearest town was still hours away by foot, and I didn't want to risk walking in the dark or getting lost again. I spent the day boarding up the windows as best I could, piling wood and stones in front of the door. I knew it wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I kept the fire burning and my axe close at hand. That night, the sounds returned, but this time I heard something moving on the roof. Heavy, slow steps that shook the old wood. I crouched by the fire, sweating, heart hammering, and tried to stay quiet. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sky started to lighten, the noises stopped. The following day, I debated what to do. I was alone, tired, scared, but I couldn't stay. The cabin felt less safe than before. I packed my bag, taking only the essentials and the axe. I waited until midday, hoping to catch a vehicle on the dirt road. I walked down to the road and waited, watching and listening. After a long while, I spotted a truck coming slowly toward me. I waved my arms until it stopped. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, asked where I was headed. I told him I needed a ride back to Sisters. He nodded and said he'd been in the area hunting. He mentioned the forest had been active lately with bears and maybe something bigger. I didn't ask. The ride back felt like a dream. I was safe, the city noises creeping back in as we approached the town. Looking back, I never found out exactly what those sounds were or who or what had been circling the cabin at night. But I did learn something important about being alone in the wilderness. The forest isn't empty or quiet. It's full of life and danger you can't always see or understand. You have to respect it, stay prepared, and listen to the little warnings your instincts give you. When I finally returned to the city, I felt different, wiser and more cautious. The cabin trip was supposed to be a peaceful. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to escape the city for a few days and spend some time alone in the woods. I was 29 then, tired of the constant noise and rush of life in New York. I wanted to find a place where I could just breathe, hear the silence, and maybe figure out some things in my head. I found a small cabin for rent in the Adirondack Mountains, near a tiny town called Ticonderoga, New York. It was off the grid, no phone, no TV, no internet. Perfect. The cabin was nothing fancy but cozy, made of old logs with a small porch, a wood-burning stove, and 2 rooms inside. It was located at the end of a narrow dirt road, about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. The area around was thick forest, mostly pine and maple trees, with a narrow creek running nearby. The owner warned me to bring all I needed because I might not see anyone for days. I arrived in the afternoon. The air was crisp, fresh. I parked my old car beside the cabin and unloaded my bags. Inside, the smell of pine mixed with dust and old wood. I checked the stove, found some firewood stacked outside, and opened the windows to let the fresh air in. I had brought some food, a lantern, a few books, and my notebook. No plans but to walk, write, and maybe fish in the creek. The first day was peaceful. I walked along the creek, watching the water ripple over rocks, spotting a few small fish. The sun was warm, the birds sang, and everything felt calm. At night, I made a fire in the stove, cooked some canned beans, and read a little before going to sleep on the creaky bed. The cabin creaked sometimes in the wind, but I didn't mind. It was part of the place's character. On the second day, I woke early and decided to explore deeper into the forest. I packed some water and a sandwich, put on my boots, and followed a narrow trail marked on an old map I had found at the town's library. The trail led uphill through dense woods, with tall trees blocking much of the sunlight. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. No planes overhead, no cars, just the occasional rustle of small animals in the bushes. I stopped often to breathe, to look at the trees and sky through gaps in the canopy. The air smelled earthy and fresh. About 3 miles in, I reached a small clearing. It had an old, rusty metal barrel lying on its side, half buried in leaves. Nearby, some broken glass bottles and scraps of plastic littered the ground. It looked like someone had camped here years ago but left in a hurry. I took a few pictures with my old camera and rested on a fallen log, eating my sandwich. I wanted to head back before dark, but as I stood up, I felt uneasy. The forest around me seemed thicker, darker, like it was closing in. I shook off the feeling, reminded myself I was just alone in the woods. No big deal. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting. The sky turned orange and pink. I made a fire again and sat outside on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. The forest was alive with night sounds now. The chirp of crickets, the hoot of an owl somewhere far, the occasional snap of a twig. That night, I couldn't sleep well. The creaks and groans of the cabin felt louder in the dark. I kept thinking about the clearing with the barrel. Why was there trash there? Who else came out here? The thought made the night feel colder. On the third day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I cleaned up a little, swept the floor, and checked the firewood pile. Around noon, I went down to the creek with my fishing rod. The water was cold and clear. I sat on a rock, watching the small fish swim under the surface. The sun was warm on my back. I caught a few fish, but didn't have much luck keeping them on the hook. I noticed some tracks near the creek, big footprints like from boots, but the prints were old and partially washed away. Still, it made me wonder if someone had been close by recently. I scanned the trees, but nothing moved. Later, while I was walking back to the cabin, I heard something. At first, it was faint, a soft rustling, like someone moving through the bushes. I stopped, froze. The sound stopped too. My heart beat faster. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me the rest of the day. That evening, I made dinner early and sat inside the cabin by the stove. I tried to read but kept looking outside the window. The woods looked dark and deep now. I heard noises again. Distant cracking of branches, faint footsteps maybe, but nothing close enough to see. Around 11 p.m., I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was different. A slow, dragging noise outside, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I didn't want to get up, scared to look out, but curiosity won. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door a little. The porch was empty, but in the moonlight, I saw marks on the ground. Deep grooves, like someone had dragged a heavy object toward the forest edge. I shined the light along the marks but saw nothing else. The woods beyond were black, silent. I locked the door and went back inside. My hands were shaking. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the stove, listening. The next morning, I found something new. By the front door, there were more footprints, fresher this time. Boots, sized large, mud sticking to the soles. They led from the woods to the porch and then back again, like someone had been there but didn't want to stay long. I packed my things quickly. I wanted to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I had no cell phone signal to call for help. I was stuck. The day dragged on. I tried to get the car working with a few makeshift attempts, but nothing. I went into the woods to try to find the dirt road, maybe hitchhike to the nearest town. The forest felt strange now. Every sound, every shadow seemed bigger, threatening. I walked for nearly 2 hours, following the road as best as I could. I heard footsteps behind me several times, but when I looked back, no one was there. I saw broken branches, recent footprints that didn't match mine. It was clear someone else was out here, but no one should be. By late afternoon, I found an old ranger station, abandoned and boarded up. I waited there, hoping someone would come by. A few hours later, I heard a truck engine. I ran to the road and waved my arms. The truck stopped. The driver was an older man who knew about the cabin and the area. He told me some locals were suspicious of strangers. Sometimes people left traps or set up scare tactics to keep others away. He said the footprints and dragging marks I saw might be part of that. He helped jumpstart my car and gave me a ride back to town. When I finally left the woods, I felt relief I hadn't expected. The cabin was beautiful and peaceful on the surface, but the reality was different. The loneliness, the unknown people around, the strange signs of someone else's presence. It all combined to make me feel vulnerable, unsafe. Looking back, I understand why the locals were wary. The wilderness can be unforgiving, not just because of animals or weather, but because of people who live by their own rules out there. The trip taught me a lot. Sometimes, escaping to nature isn't about finding peace, but facing uncomfortable truths about isolation and trust. I never went back to that cabin again, but I'm glad I went once, to see the woods with my own eyes, to feel the quiet that's not always peaceful, and to learn that sometimes the scariest thing is not what you imagine, but what you actually encounter. I was 31 the year I rented the cabin up near the Porcupine Hills in Alberta. That was back in 2019. My name's Jared Malone. I'd been working construction jobs nonstop for over a year without a break, just grinding through 12-hour shifts, 5 or 6 days a week. My back was aching, my hands were stiff every morning, and I felt like I hadn't taken a deep breath in months. I needed a break from people, noise, and screens. So when I found a listing for a remote, off-grid cabin, I booked it for 2 weeks without thinking twice. The place was about a 2-hour drive west from Nanton. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors. The listing said it had solar panels for some light, a propane stove, and a water pump, but everything else was manual. It was perfect. I loaded up my old Chevy Blazer with gear, an axe, cooler, a few propane tanks, a solar charger for emergencies, and a thick stack of paperbacks. I even brought a trail cam for fun, in case I spotted wildlife. The drive-in was already like stepping back in time. Gravel roads narrowed into a single track of dirt and grass, and then finally into a barely visible trail only wide enough for the Blazer. When I arrived, the cabin was just how the pictures showed it. Small, old, solid logs stacked into a one-room structure with a low porch, a tin chimney, and a shed off to the side. I could smell pine everywhere. No tire tracks, no footprints, no signs of anyone else for miles. Inside, it was simple. A cot, a small wood stove, a propane burner, shelves with some canned goods and tools, and a table with 2 chairs. Everything creaked a bit, but it was clean and dry. I set my gear down, stretched, and for the first time in a long while, I felt calm. The first 3 days were exactly what I wanted. I chopped wood, read books on the porch, walked around the forest trails, and cooked simple meals. Mornings started with mist rising off the trees, and the evenings were full of nothing but crickets and the occasional rustle in the brush. There was a small creek about half a mile down the hill, and I went there every day with my water jugs. Coldest water I ever tasted. On the 4th night, I woke up around 3 a.m. because I thought I heard something moving outside. At first, I assumed it was a deer or a raccoon. The area had plenty of wildlife. I lay still and listened. Something was crunching twigs, heavy steps. It wasn't fast, just a slow, deliberate pacing near the side of the cabin. I sat up and reached for the flashlight by my cot. When I shone it out the window, I didn't see anything, but the footsteps had stopped. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing obvious, no big prints, no signs of anything rummaging through my supplies. I told myself maybe it was a moose walking by and I just got spooked, but I couldn't quite shake the way the steps had sounded. Slow, measured, not like an animal trotting or crashing through the bush. I moved on, mostly, spent the day fishing at a lake I found on my topographic map. I caught 2 small trout, cleaned them at the water's edge, and cooked them up with some beans that evening. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip down behind the trees, when I noticed something odd in the woods about 100 yards out. It looked like a faint trail, not one I'd made. I walked out to it and saw the grass had been pressed down recently. It wasn't a path made by animals. The width was too uniform, almost like footprints, but the grass was only lightly bent and no clear shoe treads. I knelt and looked closer. It led away from the cabin and curved into the thick trees. I didn't follow it. I marked it in my head and went back to the cabin, but I started locking the door at night after that, even though it barely had a latch. I also brought my axe inside. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing creaks, pops, and what sounded like movement outside again. But when I turned on the flashlight and checked, nothing. Couldn't relax. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't want to be far in case something happened. I moved the firewood inside, stacked cans in front of the door to hear if it opened, and set up the trail cam I'd brought, aiming it toward the woods where that strange trail had been. I felt a little silly, like maybe I was letting my imagination get the best of me, but the hairs on my neck wouldn't settle. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I heard the same slow footsteps again, crunching softly through the dry underbrush. Then something tapped lightly on the porch wood. Just 1 or 2 taps. I froze. The stove had gone out, so it was cold inside, and the air felt sharp. I kept the flashlight off this time and just listened. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. Then, about a minute later, the lightest thud against the door, like the weight of a hand or a shoulder. Not enough to open it, just pressure. I didn't move. I stayed in my cot until sunrise. When it got light, I checked the trail cam right away. The memory card showed the timestamp had advanced overnight, but no pictures. That was odd. It had been set to motion detection. I checked the settings. Everything was right. It should have snapped something. Maybe the batteries died or it malfunctioned. I walked the area where I'd heard the sounds. I found a small piece of fabric stuck to a branch about knee height. Dark blue or black, torn like from a jacket. I didn't own anything that color. By this point, I was more than unsettled. I took my pack and hiked to the highest ridge I could reach before noon and got 1 bar of cell service. Just enough to text my buddy Keith back home. I told him I thought someone might be messing with me and that I was thinking of cutting the trip short. He said if I felt off, I should trust my gut. I hiked back by late afternoon. I didn't like the idea of walking that trail in the dark. When I got to the cabin, the shed door was wide open. I hadn't left it like that. Inside, some of the tools had been moved. The old shovel leaned against the wall now instead of hanging, and the extra propane tank I kept tucked in the back was rolled out. Not stolen, just moved, like someone wanted me to know they'd been there. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the table, axe on my lap, flashlight off. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, this time closer, right up against the walls of the cabin. I held my breath. There was no sound for a while. Then I heard what sounded like someone dragging their fingers lightly across the wall. Just a soft scrape, then silence. To first light, I packed everything, threw it all into the blazer and left without even eating. I kept looking in the mirror the whole drive out. My heart didn't stop pounding until I got back on pavement near town. 2 days later, after I got back to Calgary, I reviewed the trail cam card again just to check. I found something odd. One frame, time-stamped around 2:10 a.m., showed a blurry, dark shape near the tree line. Could have been a shadow, could have been a person. The angle was off, but the shape looked upright and you could barely make out what might be a shoulder or head. No face, no details, just a smudge. I called the property manager and told them someone had been creeping around out there. They said I was the only one who had booked the cabin for the past 3 months. They said they'd go check on it, but I never followed up. I didn't want to know. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still go outside the city sometimes, but only with friends. I think about that cabin a lot. How someone out there had been watching me, walking around at night, touching the walls, moving things just enough to get in my head. I didn't see a ghost, no monsters, just the sense that someone was out there who didn't want to be seen. And I still wonder what they were waiting for, or why they stopped. I don't think I'll ever go that far off the grid again. Some quiet places aren't empty, they're just hiding something. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything. This was in late September of 2017, after I'd just wrapped up a hectic quarter at the construction firm where I worked as a project manager. Between long commutes, late-night planning meetings, and fixing other people's mistakes, I'd barely had a moment to breathe. I didn't have a family of my own, just a girlfriend I was seeing on and off at the time, and she was out of the country then anyway. I figured it was as good a time as any to get away for a bit. A buddy from high school had mentioned a cabin he'd stayed at once near Flathead Lake in Montana, somewhere quiet, tucked into the woods on the east side of the lake. He said it was pretty remote and perfect if you wanted to disappear for a while. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted stillness. Somewhere I didn't have to hear anyone talking or see anyone's headlights at night. So I booked the cabin for 10 days through a small local rental site, packed my truck with enough food and gear to last me comfortably, and made the drive from Spokane. The road to the cabin turned from highway to gravel after about 3 hours. It was nearly dark by the time I reached the property. A narrow stretch of road winding through thick pines and firs, where the sky disappeared above you. The GPS on my phone had lost service 20 minutes before, but I had printed directions and a topographic map, just in case. The last mile was barely more than a track, ruts and rocks and dry grass scraping the undercarriage of my truck. When I pulled up to the cabin, I was pleasantly surprised. It wasn't run down like I'd feared. It had a metal roof, a small porch with 2 old rocking chairs, and a stack of firewood neatly piled to the side. The windows were shut and curtained, and there was a faint smell of pine and old smoke in the air. I unlocked the front door with the code I'd been given and stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one open room with a bed in the corner, a kitchenette along the back wall, and a wood-burning stove near the center. There was also a narrow door to a bathroom that had a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower that pulled water from a rain collection barrel out back. It was rough living, but I liked it. There was no power, but I had a few solar lanterns and a battery pack for charging my phone. Not that I had service. I switched my phone to airplane mode and stuffed it into a drawer. I wasn't planning on using it unless I had to. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I woke up with the light, made coffee on a small gas stove I brought, and spent most of the day reading or walking trails I marked with orange ribbon. The forest was quiet. I'd hear birds in the morning and the occasional rustle of branches from squirrels or wind. I fished a bit in a nearby stream and even spotted a deer one afternoon, drinking from the water. At night, I'd light a fire, cook a simple meal, and sit out on the porch until it got too cold. By the fourth night, though, I started to feel a little off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a vague sense that something was out of place. It started with the path behind the cabin. I'd made a small trail to take short walks, just looping through the woods and back. I'd marked the trees with small reflective tacks, easy to spot with a flashlight. That evening, I took a walk around sunset. The light was dimming quickly, and I was halfway through the loop when I noticed that a few of the tacks were missing. I hadn't counted them, but I knew there should have been one on a particular tree near a downed log, and it wasn't there. I chalked it up to my own memory or maybe animals rubbing against the trees, knocking them loose. The next morning, I decided to double-check. I walked the loop again in the daylight. 3 of the tacks were gone, cleanly removed, not scratched or fallen. I found one of them on the ground under the tree, still perfectly intact. That unsettled me a bit. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard a single engine or voice since I got there. I brushed it off as overthinking, picked up the loose tack, and re-nailed it to the tree. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint noises outside, not the usual forest sounds, just these soft, intermittent snaps, like twigs breaking under careful weight. I'd sit up in bed, hold my breath, and strain to hear more, but the sounds would stop. I didn't want to let my imagination get ahead of me, so I tried to ignore it. On the 6th day, I went to refill the water tank from the collection barrel behind the cabin. That was when I found footprints. Not mine. These were narrower with a different tread pattern. They circled around the back of the cabin and led off toward the treeline. I crouched down and studied them. They were faint, like someone had been walking carefully, but they were there. I followed them a short way into the woods, but they vanished into the undergrowth. Now I was more than unsettled. I didn't bring a gun, just a hunting knife and a hatchet. I hadn't seen a soul for 6 days, and now there were footprints around my cabin that didn't belong to me. I went back inside and locked the door, even though I wasn't sure how much good that would do. It was a simple wooden door with a deadbolt. It wouldn't stop anyone determined. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the bed with the hatchet in my lap and a flashlight close by. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was awake. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Twigs breaking softly, like footsteps circling the cabin. Then silence. Then again. I crept over to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the curtains. I couldn't see anything, just black trees and the dim outline of the firewood stack. But I knew someone was out there. I could feel it. The next morning, I found something else. Tied to the railing of the porch with twine was one of the reflective tacks, just hanging there. I hadn't put it there. I hadn't lost one since I reattached the others. That was it for me. I packed everything I could into the truck. I didn't care that I had 4 days left. I needed to leave. But when I tried to start the truck, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. I popped the hood, checked the connections, everything looked fine. I wasn't a mechanic, but the battery didn't seem dead. It was like the ignition wasn't getting any power. I tried again. Nothing. Panic started to creep in. I was 15 miles from the nearest paved road. I had no phone service, no radio. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was. Just a general area near Flathead Lake. I spent the rest of that day trying to figure out what to do. I thought about hiking out, but it was already late afternoon, and I didn't want to get caught in the woods after dark. I decided to wait until first light, pack a small bag, and try to reach the main road on foot. I could flag down someone or maybe find a ranger station. That night, I didn't sleep again. I sat in the dark with the lantern turned off, listening. Around midnight, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. Not a branch, not an animal. It was deliberate. A sharp, single knock. Then another. Then silence. I held my breath and waited. I didn't move for hours. When the light finally started to creep in through the windows, I grabbed my backpack, knife, water, and protein bars, and left the cabin without looking back. The woods felt different that morning. Colder, like something was watching. I walked fast, sticking to the trail I'd driven in on, keeping my eyes and ears sharp. After 2 hours, I reached the gravel road. Still no service. I kept walking. Around noon, I saw a truck parked at the side of the road, a ranger vehicle. I waved them down and they pulled over. I told them I'd been staying in the cabin and that someone had been watching me, messing with my stuff. They offered to drive back with me to check it out, but I refused. I just wanted to get to town. Later that day, a mechanic confirmed my truck's ignition system had been deliberately tampered with. Wires under the steering column had been cut clean, like someone had used a blade. The sheriff took a report, but nothing ever came of it. No fingerprints, no suspects, no explanation. Just an empty cabin and a shaken-up man with a broken truck. I never went back. I still don't know who was out there with me. Maybe a squatter, a hunter gone wrong, someone hiding from something or someone. Or maybe it was just a person who liked being out there in the woods alone until I showed up. Maybe I broke their peace. Whatever it was, it reminded me how small I really am out there. How quickly control can slip away. I still camp, still hike, but I stay closer to roads now, closer to people. And I always tell someone exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. Because next time, I might not be so lucky. I took a week off from work in the fall of 2019. I was 33 at the time, working long shifts as a maintenance technician for a local transit company in Albany. That year had been rough. I had been dealing with stress, insomnia, and a breakup that left me feeling worn thin. I didn't want to go somewhere crowded or expensive. I just wanted peace and time to be by myself, and I figured I'd find that in the mountains. I found an old off-grid cabin for rent on a site that catered to outdoor enthusiasts. It was buried deep in the southern stretch of the Adirondack Mountains, just outside a tiny place called Wells. The ad said it was accessible by a long gravel road, had no electricity, no running water, no Wi-Fi. There was a wood stove, a hand pump for water outside, and a dry toilet in a shed out back. That was it. It sounded perfect. The owner, a retired guy named Mike, told me by email that it was often used by hunters or people wanting to disconnect completely. He said he wouldn't be around during my stay. I packed my old Jeep with the essentials: canned food, bottled water, extra clothes, a hatchet, a sleeping bag, a solar lantern, a camping stove, and a couple of notebooks. I even brought a .22 rifle I used occasionally at the range, just in case. I wasn't expecting any trouble, but I've always believed it's better to be prepared, especially when going off-grid. I left on a Monday morning and drove for over 3 hours, most of it on back roads with no cell signal. The last leg was a narrow gravel lane that twisted through dense forest, branches slapping the side mirrors as I drove. I passed no other cabins, no homes, no signs. Just woods, the road, and the sound of gravel under the tires. Finally, the trees opened up and I saw the cabin. It was a small, weathered structure with a steep metal roof and a covered porch. The front faced a shallow slope that dropped off into thick woods. There was an old fire pit made of stacked stone and a rusty metal chair near the pump. It was almost 4 when I got there, and the air had that dry, smoky scent of fallen leaves. I unloaded my gear and brought it inside. The place was simple: one main room with a bed, a table, a couple of chairs, and the wood stove. The walls were unpainted pine, and everything smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. There were a few shelves stocked with matches, candles, and some old tools. It was cold inside, so I made a fire and spent a while chopping kindling from the log pile behind the cabin. That first evening was calm. I cooked a simple meal and ate outside on the porch while the sun went down. The woods grew dark fast, and the silence was deep. No car sounds, no voices, just the occasional rustle of squirrels in the leaves or a distant owl. I stayed up for a while writing in one of my notebooks, then turned in early. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. The next couple of days followed a quiet rhythm. I woke early, made coffee on the camping stove, went for long hikes through the woods, and returned to cook dinner before dark. I started to feel better, less anxious, less wired. I didn't miss my phone, didn't think about work. Just quiet days and long walks under the orange canopy of autumn trees. On Thursday, I hiked farther than usual, trying to follow an old logging trail I'd seen on a paper map I brought. I spent most of the day out, walking steadily for hours. I marked my path with small rock piles and took note of landmarks. Fallen trees, strange stumps, moss patterns. Around 3, I turned back. It took longer than expected to return, and by the time I made it back to the cabin, it was nearly dark. I was tired and a little sore but satisfied. I ate fast and collapsed into bed, not even bothering to light a candle. That night, something changed. I woke up in the early morning. It was still dark out and the fire had gone out. The inside of the cabin was quiet, but I had the distinct feeling that something was off. I wasn't sure what had woken me. I stayed still, listening. There were no noises inside. But then I heard something faint, almost like a soft crunch outside. Not close, but not far either. It was the sound of someone or something walking on dry leaves. I sat up slowly, heart beginning to beat faster. I thought maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. The woods were full of them, but the sound wasn't like an animal moving through brush. It was spaced out, rhythmic, 2 steps, then a pause, then 2 more. And it was slow, not the way a deer would walk. I stayed still for a long time, listening. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I convinced myself it had been nothing. Maybe a branch falling, maybe wind. I dozed off again, though lightly. In the morning, I went outside and checked around the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual. No prints, no signs of anything disturbed. But I noticed that the pump handle was wet, even though it hadn't rained. That struck me as strange. I hadn't used the pump since the afternoon before. It was chilly enough that dew wasn't forming like it would in summer. I brushed it off, figuring I might have left it like that, and tried not to let it bother me. That night, the unease returned. I hadn't hiked far that day, just stuck close to the cabin, splitting firewood and writing. But as darkness fell, I kept looking over my shoulder, drawn to the tree line. Something felt different, like the woods were too quiet. I kept the fire going later than usual and slept with the lantern nearby. Again, I woke in the early hours. This time, I knew what had woken me. There was a sound closer than before. It was a soft scrape, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. My pulse quickened. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, but from a different side. It sounded like someone walking slowly around the cabin, dragging something. I sat up and grabbed the rifle. I didn't want to go outside, but I wanted to be ready. I held still, trying to calm my breathing and listen. The sounds continued for a while, then stopped. I waited a long time before moving. When daylight came, I went outside immediately. I circled the cabin carefully. On the far side, near the woodshed, I found something that made my skin crawl. There were marks in the dirt, long, straight drag lines. Not footprints, not paw prints. Just 2 parallel lines that started a few feet from the wall and led back into the woods. Like someone had been pulling a stick or a tool along the ground. There were no clear boot prints, nothing else. I felt sick to my stomach. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't want to panic, but I couldn't ignore it either. I stayed alert all day, constantly scanning the woods. I didn't go for a walk, didn't even leave the porch. I kept the rifle loaded and nearby. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night was colder, and the wind picked up. I kept the fire strong and left the lantern on low. I didn't sleep well, kept jerking awake at every little creak. Around 2 a.m., I heard the steps again. This time, they were right outside the door. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I held my breath, frozen. Then something tapped the window, 3 soft, even taps. Not an animal, not the wind. It was unmistakable. I raised the rifle and crept toward the window, heart pounding. I couldn't see anything in the dark, just the dim outline of trees. I stood there for minutes, rifle shaking in my hands. No more sounds. Nothing moved. Eventually, I backed away and waited until dawn, not sleeping at all. In the morning, I found what I was afraid I'd find. Scuff marks below the window and faint impressions near the door. No footprints, but disturbances in the leaves, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. I decided then I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything as fast as I could and loaded the Jeep. I didn't eat, didn't stop. just drove straight out without looking back. The gravel road was rougher than I remembered, and I felt a sick wave of relief when I finally hit pavement again. It was like crossing a border into safety. My phone found a signal an hour later, and I called a friend in Albany to let him know I was coming early. I didn't tell him the full story, just said I had cut the trip short. I never went back to that cabin, and I never contacted the owner. When I got home, I looked up missing persons reports in the area and found nothing unusual. But to this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted. What still gets to me is how careful they were. Never leaving prints, never making noise during the day. Just enough presence to keep me on edge. Sometimes I wonder if it was someone living off the grid, maybe just messing with me. Or maybe someone else who had used that cabin before and didn't like anyone else being there. Either way, it felt personal, intentional. Now, when I go into the woods, I always trust that first flicker of unease. I don't ignore it anymore, and I never, ever stay somewhere I can't leave in under 5 minutes. I was 34 when I decided to take a break from everything and head out to the mountains for a few weeks. It was early October of 2019, and the last few years had just worn me out. My job in Dallas had become a grind. My friends were either getting married or moving away, and I hadn't taken more than a weekend off in almost 2 years. I didn't want to go somewhere tropical or busy. I wanted to be alone, just somewhere cold and quiet with no traffic and no schedule. So I rented a small off-grid cabin up in northwestern Montana, about 40 minutes west of a town called Libby. The listing said it was a one-room cabin with a small loft for sleeping, no running water, and solar power for lights. It had a wood stove and a basic propane burner for cooking, and it came with a big stack of chopped firewood. The pictures showed it sitting at the end of a narrow dirt trail, nestled among thick pine trees, with no neighbors in sight. It looked perfect. The owner gave me a simple set of instructions for check-in, told me there was no cell service anywhere nearby, and that I should bring enough food for the entire stay. I packed canned soup, pasta, rice, trail mix, coffee, oatmeal, and about 5 gallons of drinking water. I also packed some basic tools, a hatchet, a flashlight, and a pistol I kept for safety when hiking alone. I didn't expect to need it, but I figured better safe than sorry. The drive up from Dallas took 2 days. I stopped overnight in Casper, Wyoming, then pushed through the last 8 hours to Montana the next morning. It was cold by the time I got near Libby, high 40s in the afternoon, dropping into the 30s at night. Leaves were falling, the trees up in the hills already bare in some places. When I finally turned off the paved road and followed the narrow gravel path that led toward the cabin, I could feel everything slowing down inside me. The dirt trail was rough and climbed steadily uphill. My tires kicked up dust and pine needles as I drove through a canopy of tall lodgepole pines, golden larches, and a few Douglas firs that still clung to their needles. The sun filtered through the branches in long, sharp beams. The cabin was just like the pictures, maybe even a little better. It was small, maybe 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with a covered porch, dark brown log walls, and a silver chimney pipe sticking up through the roof. The windows had wooden shutters that could be latched from inside. The door was solid and heavy, and the padlock opened with the combination the owner had given me. Inside, the cabin smelled like old pine, smoke, and a hint of kerosene. There was a cot-style bed up in the loft, a table and 2 chairs downstairs, some open shelving, and a compact little kitchen area. I unpacked my gear, set up my sleeping bag upstairs, and lit a fire in the stove to chase out the cold. By the time the sun went down, it was warm and quiet inside, with the sound of wind in the trees the only thing I could hear outside. For the first 2 days, it was exactly what I needed. I chopped more firewood, hiked a little on the nearby trails, cooked simple meals, and read a book by the light of a solar lantern. I kept my phone off, even though it wouldn't have worked anyway. I slept deeply each night, the kind of sleep I hadn't had in years. There was no traffic, no emails, no background noise, just silence and the occasional rustle of wildlife outside. It was on the 3rd night that things started to feel off. Nothing big at first, just a small sound, barely noticeable. I was lying upstairs in the loft, half asleep, when I thought I heard a crunch outside. Not wind, not the creak of wood, but something stepping on leaves or twigs. I sat up slowly and listened. It didn't repeat, just silence. Maybe a deer or raccoon, I thought. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to stretch and walk around a bit. The ground was damp from some light rain overnight, and I noticed a few faint impressions in the dirt near the back of the cabin. At first, I figured they were just from a squirrel or maybe a fox, but one of them looked off. It was deeper, wider, and more deliberate, like a shoe print, but without clear tread marks. Almost like someone had been walking around out back in smooth-soled boots. I looked around the trees. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, just still woods and damp needles. I checked the door and windows, but everything was still locked from the inside. I told myself it was probably just my own track from when I'd walked around yesterday, maybe distorted by the rain. Still, I didn't like the feeling I had in my chest. That night, I brought the pistol upstairs with me and set it near the sleeping bag. I kept the fire low and the lantern off once I was settled, just in case anyone was outside watching. I stared at the ceiling for hours, barely blinking. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I heard it again, this time closer. A deliberate crunch, then another, then nothing. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't move like an animal. There were no sniffing sounds, no scampering. Just 2 slow steps, then silence. I stayed frozen in place, heart hammering, ears straining in the dark. I didn't get up. I didn't move. I just lay there, gun in hand, waiting. By morning, the ground outside was dry again, but I still found prints. This time, more of them. They led from the trees, circled the side of the cabin, then disappeared into the woods behind it. Definitely not animal prints. Long, narrow, heel-to-toe patterns that looked like a person walking slowly. Too big for a woman, but not huge. The toe of one dragged slightly, like maybe they had a limp. I crouched down and stared at them for a long time, just trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here? Why would someone be walking circles around a remote cabin at night? That day, I didn't go for a hike. I stayed close. I kept the pistol on my hip and gathered some large branches to lean against the windows from the inside. Not for protection exactly, but just so I'd hear if something pushed against them. I also moved the table in front of the front door. There was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, and the nearest house was probably 10 miles down a steep road that would be hard to drive in the dark. I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to drive that trail at night. I decided to stay just one more night and head out first thing in the morning. That was a mistake. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft sound. Not footsteps this time, but something brushing gently against the outside of the wall. A soft, scraping drag. Not loud, but constant, like someone was slowly running a stick or knife down the logs of the cabin. My throat tightened. I slipped out of the sleeping bag, grabbed the pistol, and crouched low near the edge of the loft where I could peek down. I had left the lantern near the stove, unlit. The only light was from the dying fire. Shadows flickered faintly on the walls. The scraping stopped. Then a new sound, something tapping softly against the window glass. Not hard, not like trying to break in. Just light taps, like fingernails. I stayed completely still. The tapping moved from one window to the next. Tap, tap, then nothing. The rest of the night was dead silent. At first light, I packed everything in 10 minutes flat. I didn't even eat. I grabbed my bag, threw it into the car, and drove out of there faster than I should have. My tires skidded on loose gravel and caught in small ruts, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get down the mountain. Back in Libby, I stopped at a diner and used their Wi-Fi to message the cabin owner. I didn't go into details, just said there was evidence someone had been walking around the property at night and that I was leaving early. He replied 2 hours later and said I was the only renter on the calendar that week. He hadn't been up to the cabin in months. I didn't go to the police. I had no solid evidence, just footprints, sounds, and fear. Nothing was stolen, no one got hurt, and I had no license plate or name. Just someone or something out in the woods who knew that cabin was alone. I went back to Texas and tried to forget it. I threw away the clothes I'd worn up there. I didn't talk about it. I didn't go camping for a long time after that. But sometimes, even now, when I'm lying in bed in my apartment, I'll think I hear that sound again, the light tapping on glass. And I'll remember how out there, in the middle of nowhere, with no phone, no neighbors, and no help, someone was walking around my cabin in the dark, not trying to get in, just watching. And for me, that was worse. It was October 2019 when I decided to take a break from work. I was living in Fort Wayne, Indiana, working long hours at a car parts warehouse. I had just turned 33, and I felt burnt out. The constant noise, the gray ceiling lights, the forklift alarms. It was starting to mess with my sleep. I was waking up in the middle of the night for no reason. My doctor said I needed rest. So I looked for a quiet place, away from people and machines. I found a small off-grid cabin up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near a place called Garden Corners. It was tucked away in the woods and could be rented by the week. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just a cabin, a generator, a propane heater, and a hand pump for water. I packed what I needed: non-perishable food, a cooler with ice packs, a camping stove, a flashlight, batteries, a first aid kit, my old sleeping bag, and a hunting knife I'd had since I was 20. I drove up in my 2006 Toyota Tacoma, leaving before sunrise to make the 8-hour trip. The further north I got, the quieter everything became. By the time I passed Escanaba and turned west into the Hiawatha National Forest, the radio had cut out, and I hadn't seen another car for half an hour. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough. Tree branches scraped the sides of the truck, and I had to drive slow to keep from blowing a tire on the rocks. The road ended in a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was just one story, built from dark wood, with a sloped tin roof and a tiny front porch. There were no other buildings around, no power lines, nothing man-made in sight except for an old outhouse about 20 yards into the trees. I turned off the engine and just sat there for a minute. The silence was unreal. I could hear leaves rustling, birds chirping, and nothing else. No hum of traffic, no buzzing electronics. Felt strange but good. I stepped out, stretched, and walked to the cabin door. The key had been mailed to me by the owner, a guy named Russell, along with handwritten instructions on how to use the propane and start the generator. Inside, it was bare but clean. A wood table, 2 chairs, a twin mattress on a wooden frame, and a small counter with some shelves above it. There was no fridge, just a pantry with mouse traps already set. The walls were made of rough logs, and the air smelled like pine and old smoke. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked through the woods during the day, made simple meals, and wrote in a notebook. I didn't bring my laptop on purpose. At night, I lit a few candles, read old paperback novels, and slept better than I had in months. The air was cool and the quiet helped. I woke up with the sun and didn't think once about work. I didn't even keep track of the time. On the 3rd morning, I noticed something strange. I went outside to pump water and saw boot prints in the mud near the side of the cabin. They were fresh, deep, like someone had stepped there not long ago. My boots were still clean, and I hadn't walked over there. The prints were larger than mine and had a thick tread pattern. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I figured maybe a hunter had passed through. The area was popular with bow hunters, and it wasn't hunting season yet, but some people scouted early. Still, it felt off. The prints were close to the cabin. Too close. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing things. Small creaks in the wall, the wind pushing at the shutters, a soft thud outside like a branch hitting the ground. I tried to ignore it, but around 2 a.m., I got up and looked out the window. I didn't see anything. I left the flashlight on the nightstand and laid back down. The next day, I decided to walk in a wide loop around the cabin, looking for signs of anyone passing through. I didn't find much, but about 100 yards east, I found something strange. A rusted metal folding chair, almost swallowed up by weeds. It looked like it had been there a while. Near it were empty cans of beef stew, half buried in leaves. Someone had camped out there recently. It was probably nothing. Still, I walked back to the cabin with a weird feeling in my chest. That evening, I locked the door and pushed the table in front of it. It felt dumb, like I was being paranoid, but I didn't want to wake up to more footprints. I kept my hunting knife beside the bed. I left the flashlight on again. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. Not the wind, not an animal. It was a kind of scraping, low and steady. I sat up and listened. It stopped. I stayed frozen in bed for a long time, staring at the door, heart pounding. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again. When I woke up in the morning, the table had moved. Not a lot, just a few inches. Enough to make me stop breathing for a second. I know I pushed it flush against the door. Now it was off-center, like it had been bumped. The lock was still latched. I checked the windows, all shut. I went outside, walked the perimeter, and found fresh boot prints again. The same ones. This time, they went behind the cabin and disappeared into the woods. I spent the whole day on edge. Every sound made me jump. I kept checking the tree line. I considered leaving, but it was already Friday, and I was supposed to head back Sunday morning. I told myself I could handle 2 more nights. I kept my knife on me and moved the mattress so I could sleep closer to the door. That night was colder. I didn't light the candles. I didn't want any light showing through the windows. I sat in the dark with the flashlight in my lap, listening. It was dead quiet. Around 1 a.m., I heard something on the porch. Soft steps, then a knock. Just one. Not loud, not hard, just a knock. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting. Whoever was out there didn't knock again. After maybe 5 minutes, the steps moved off the porch and faded into the woods. I stayed up until sunrise, clutching the flashlight, barely blinking. When it got light, I went outside. There were footprints on the porch. Clear ones, the same tread pattern. But here's the part that really messed with me. There were no footprints leading up to the porch, only leading away, like someone had been standing there for hours or had come up some other way. I checked around, and sure enough, I found marks on the side of the porch. Someone had climbed up from the side. I was done. I packed my things in 10 minutes and got in the truck. The road out felt longer than before. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting someone to step out into the path. When I hit paved road again, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near Iron Mountain. I used the bathroom, bought a bottle of water, and tried to calm down. I called the cabin owner once I had signal and told him what happened. He sounded surprised but not exactly concerned. He just said the area sometimes got squatters or old survivalists passing through. I drove straight home and didn't look back. For weeks after that, I kept waking up at night, expecting to hear footsteps outside my window. I started locking every door twice, even in the middle of the day. Took time to feel normal again. I don't know who was out there. Maybe just someone living off-grid. Maybe someone scoping out empty cabins. But the way they moved, the silence, the knocking, the footprints that didn't match up, it felt deliberate. Like they were trying to mess with me. Or worse, like they were testing what they could get away with. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still like the idea of being alone in nature. But next time I'll bring a friend, and a gun, and maybe stay somewhere with a working phone. That cabin is probably still there, empty most of the year. Someone else will rent it and maybe they'll have a peaceful time. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the sound of that single knock. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo trip to a remote cabin in the Catskill Mountains, about 3 hours northwest of New York City. It was early October 2019. I had just left my job at a startup that was sinking fast, and I needed time away from screens, people, and the anxiety that had been eating at me for months. The idea was to spend a full week off-grid, completely alone, to reset my head. I found the place through a listing site that specialized in isolated rental properties. The cabin was owned by a retired carpenter named Gene, who had built it himself back in the early 80s. He rarely rented it out, but the photos caught my eye. Old wood, no cell reception, a fire pit, and a view of the hills from a back deck. The place didn't have Wi-Fi or even a landline. The listing made that very clear. You either wanted to be alone or you didn't. I thought I did. I drove up in my 2010 Subaru Forester, packed with enough food for a week, a box of firewood, a few books, a map, a hand crank radio, and a big thermos of coffee. The road got worse the farther I went, turning from cracked pavement to loose gravel and then to muddy tracks through thick woods. The GPS gave out about 20 minutes before I reached the place, and I had to rely on printed directions I'd scribbled down just in case. The cabin sat on a small hill surrounded by a mix of pines and leaf-shedding trees that were just starting to turn orange and red. There was no fence, no neighbors, nothing but woods in all directions. I parked beside a weather-beaten shed with a broken padlock hanging from it and made my way up the porch stairs. The key was exactly where Jean said it would be, taped behind a loose board beside the door. Inside, the cabin smelled like dry wood and old pine needles. Everything was handmade, uneven but solid. The floors creaked, the windows were cloudy with age, and the furniture looked like it had been built from scratch by someone with strong hands and a lot of time. There was a fireplace, a small gas stove, a hand pump for water by the kitchen sink, and an outhouse about 30 yards behind the cabin. The place ran on propane and firewood. I liked that. It forced me to keep busy and think about basic stuff, like staying warm, eating on time, and making sure the lamps were full of fuel before dark. I unpacked slowly, putting things in drawers, stacking my food, double-checking that I had everything. Then I spent the rest of the day collecting kindling from the woods nearby and getting familiar with the area. By nightfall, the woods were so quiet it made my ears ring. There was no wind, no traffic, not even the sound of planes overhead. Just crickets, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, and my own footsteps. I sat on the porch with a mug of tea, staring into the dark, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: stillness. The kind that goes beyond quiet. I went to bed early, falling asleep to the sound of logs cracking in the fireplace. The second day went smoothly. I cooked eggs on the gas stove, read half a book, and spent a couple hours following a trail that led down into a narrow valley behind the cabin. I brought my compass and marked trees on the way back so I wouldn't get turned around. It was colder than I expected, and the forest seemed thicker the deeper I went. At one point, I found the remains of a small wooden structure, just the rotted frame of something old, maybe a hunting blind or an equipment shed. It had almost fully collapsed, and vines had grown through the slats. I didn't think much of it and moved on. On the way back, I started noticing little things that were out of place. Small stacks of stones by the edge of the trail. They weren't natural, too neatly placed, almost like someone had arranged them on purpose. 3 or 4 rocks each, balanced on each other in small mounds, spaced about every 50 feet. I hadn't seen them on the way in, but I figured maybe I missed them. I wasn't spooked, just curious. I took a few photos with my old digital camera and kept walking. Back at the cabin, I spent the evening whittling a piece of wood I found by the firewood pile, just to keep my hands busy. The sun dropped fast behind the hills, and I lit the lanterns one by one. Around 9 p.m., I heard something behind the cabin, just a light snap of branches. I froze and listened. Nothing followed. Probably a deer. Still, I checked the lock on the front door, even though I knew no one was out there. I told myself I was just being cautious. By the 4th day, something had shifted. It started with small things. I woke up and found the front door slightly open, just an inch or two. I knew I'd locked it. I remember testing it before bed and even checking it again after hearing that noise the night before. The breeze outside was cold, but not strong enough to push a locked door. I looked for marks, scratches, footprints, but the ground outside was dry and hard-packed. Nothing looked disturbed. I convinced myself I hadn't shut it fully. Maybe the old lock just gave out. Later that afternoon, I found one of the rock stacks directly in front of the porch steps. That was new. No way I missed that. It hadn't been there in the morning. It looked just like the ones I saw on the trail, 3 stones carefully balanced. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if an animal could have done it. But the positioning was too clean. I didn't touch it. I went back inside and shut all the windows, even though it made the place stuffy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something walking through the leaves outside. Not skittering or fluttering, slow, deliberate steps, like boots on dry leaves. I held my breath and waited. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I didn't hear them walk away, just nothing, dead silence. I didn't dare look out the window. The next morning, I found another stack of rocks, this time on the deck rail, right where I usually rested my coffee mug. That's when I stopped pretending this was just animals or wind or my imagination. Someone was out there. Someone was messing with me. I packed up that afternoon. I shoved everything into my bags, barely folding anything. I loaded the car and was ready to drive out before sunset. But the road had changed. About 100 yards down the trail, I found a tree dropped across the path. Not a dead tree either. A fresh one, with green leaves still attached, thick trunk cleanly cut near the base like someone had used a chainsaw. But I didn't hear a saw not once during the week, not even far off. I got out and tried to move it, but it was too heavy. I couldn't drive around it either. The slope was too steep on both sides. I thought about walking the road back to the last junction, maybe 5 or 6 miles, but dusk was coming and the forest felt thicker than ever. I went back to the cabin to figure out a plan. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going, lights on, all my bags near the door. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they came right up to the porch. I sat in the dark with my hand on a hatchet I'd brought, watching the door. The steps didn't circle this time. They stopped right in front. I didn't hear knocking, just breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, like someone standing inches from the door, waiting. Then it stopped. I waited until morning before opening the door. The sun was up. Everything was still. But the front door had a deep scratch down its center. 3 straight lines like a rake or claws. Not deep, but visible. Fresh. Below it, another rock stack. This time 5 stones. I didn't think. I grabbed the axe from the shed and spent half the morning chopping that tree out of the road. I was shaking, my arms like rubber by the time I finished, but I got through. I threw everything in the car again, peeled out onto the dirt road, and didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was on the highway. I never went back for the deposit, never contacted Jean. I left the camera behind too. I didn't want any of those photos anymore. For weeks after, I kept thinking about the stacks, how they'd appeared, how someone somewhere had been watching me. They never showed their face, never made a sound. But they were close, too close. I moved to a new apartment later that year. 2nd floor, city block, bars on the windows. I still go hiking, but I don't stay overnight anymore. Not alone. Not in places where you can't get a signal. I know people are out there in the woods, some of them not right in the head, and they don't need to talk or hurt you or even break in. Sometimes they just want you to know they're there, that they see you, and that's worse, much worse.